The agenda this week learned why housing shortages aren't just a problem in Canada and heard about some new technologies for the fight against climate change. The agenda's Week in Review begins asking, how should police handle protesters?
Let's take some little look-see here at some pictures that you shot. I guess this is a little over a week ago at the Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would. Okay, to the average observer, Karima, that looks like a bit of a demonstration that is perhaps on the verge of getting a little bit out of hand. What are you seeing there, though, that goes beyond that?
I'm seeing people trying to force their way into the Eaton Centre. And in so doing, there are assaults on security guards, assaults on police, and really just a general recklessness for public health and safety. And this was one of the escalations that I've observed. So over the past few months, it's ranged from yelling at strangers on the street to the occasional physical confrontation. And that escalation is concerning.
Now, you just used the word assault to describe what you saw. That's a legal term. Do you know if, in fact, anybody was charged with assault on that occasion?
There were at least 2 people charged with assault. But if we look closely at the video, I think that there are a few more who could have received charges. And I'm not one to call for heavy-handed police action. But I think that the police response overall to anti-vax demonstrations has emboldened the protesters. And, I'll use the word escalation again, because I think that that's what we're seeing.
Okay, you better follow up on that, because are you suggesting that the police's behavior, that the way that they have responded to the anti-vax protests has in fact encouraged them to get more violent?
I think that that's a possibility. I think that there are various factors and variables at play. But if we compare some of the police response to the anti-vax protests versus behavior in other situations, such as encampments, I think that there's a very clear difference, and it's something that needs to be looked at. And even speaking to police officers during these anti-vax protests, it really tended to be a hands-off approach. We respect the right to protest, which is not inherently a problematic thing. But again, the discrepancy in treatment, I think, is something that has emboldened people.
You have heard the allegation that not all police officers in all police services across this country handle all protest circumstances the same. And we have heard the allegation, for example, that when it comes to, let's say, clearing homeless shelters out of a public park, the police may be a lot more direct and a lot more forceful, and at the end of the day may make many, many more arrests than they would, for example, in the case of trying to prevent anti-vax demonstrators from entering a shopping mall, the example I just gave. You've heard that allegation. Do you think there's something to it?
Well, I have heard that allegation, but I think there are probably many more aspects to that. It depends on what that group is doing. So sometimes, in the first example, each situation will be different. The people that you're moving out of a park, for example, that might be their entire, everything they own is there. And so the chance of that getting more emotional and more emotionally charged of a situation is probably higher. So, I don't know, our officers attend, millions of calls a year. And that includes, situations where you're asking people to move along. And I think they're very professional in how they do that. And sometimes there are court injunctions involved in those. So sometimes, the ability to enforce something is greater in different situations. So the park example, there might be a bylaw that says people can't be there and setting up camp during the daytime hours. versus a protest in a street, and there may not be a bylaw that says you can't be there. So like there are very, very many different facets to that. But I would say on the whole, our members are very professional and deal with each situation as it comes.
Now, I appreciate the nuance that you just gave in that example, but that doesn't quite, you'll forgive me, I don't think that quite gets at it, because the allegation in this case is there are many more police officers who may be in sympathy themselves with the message behind the anti-vax demonstrators, and that's why they cut them a little more slack than they would, say, the homeless people who are gathered in their tents in a public park, for whom the police, let's say, have less personal sympathy. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm. No, I don't think it is fair to say. I think it's fair to say I don't agree it's so. Our police officers across Canada, and we have a rule of law in Canada, and professional police officers, and we see countries around the world where that is not the case. We don't, individual officers have individual beliefs on many, many different areas. And if that was what determined their involvement in many scenarios, that would be very challenging. They set those aside and they deal with the situation professionally. And that is a requirement. If you can't do that, then you're in the wrong occupation.
Mike, why has supply become such an issue of late?
Well, I'd actually say that this issue goes back to about 2015 in Ontario, and it's all due to population growth. Ontario typically grows by about 100 to 120,000 people every single year, and we did rather consistently. But we had some policy changes starting in 2015, increased immigration targets, and also a more attractive market for international students. We basically changed how long international students could stay in the province after they graduate. So all of a sudden, we went from growing at about 120,000 people a year to 200,000 people a year. So we've grown by almost 1 million people over the last 5 years. If we compare the last 5 years to the previous 5 years, we've had 300,000 extra people in the province, but we've only built about 30,000 extra homes, and most of those are one-bedroom condos. So you do the math there, that's 9 or 10 extra people for every one-bedroom condo. That is going to get you a housing shortage.
Now, why is it that somewhere along the way, decision makers didn't say to themselves, we're inviting a whole lot of extra people in here and we're not giving them anywhere to live? Why didn't they make that computation?
Well, it's this fantastic problem that we have in Canada about jurisdictionality. So we have a federal government that sets rules around immigration and international student policy. Then we have the province who set their sort of growth plans and need to sort of adjust for that accordingly. And we have colleges and universities bringing in international students. And then we have the municipalities making their plans off of the provincial growth plan. And all of that takes time. And if we look at provincial growth or municipal growth plans across a province, some of these are anywhere from 5 to 15 years out of date. They don't incorporate the new immigration targets, all of those changes that are going on. And it all goes to this sort of jurisdictional problem where different levels of government are responsible for different things, and they don't necessarily interact well with each other.
Gotcha. Jenny, maybe you could give us the lay of the land in the United States, and in particular, what states the housing shortage is particularly acute.
Well, we've seen pretty similar dynamics to Canada at the national level. So house prices are up over 13% year over year, which is obviously faster than people's wages are growing. And we have similar kinds of issues on the supply side, plus demand side issues as well. So we're sandwiched between two historically large generations, the boomers, the older end, and millennials on the younger side. It's just a lot of people. Millennials in particular are reaching their peak home buying years. They're getting ready to move out of the one-bedroom apartments, buy their first house, have a little bit of extra space, and there aren't enough homes to accommodate all the people who want to live there. This has been traditionally true in places like New York and San Francisco and Boston, but we're actually seeing very rapid home price growth in some of the smaller metros, places like Boise, Idaho, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado. Those are seeing now the kinds of upwards pressure on housing prices that we've mostly associated with the big coastal cities. And the big question is, will Boise become San Francisco in 10 years?
So this is not just a blue state thing. This is happening in the red states too.
Absolutely. And we've seen some of the strongest rates of population growth and demand in places like Texas and Arizona. So the Sun Belt states have very strong demand for housing. They've traditionally built enough housing to accommodate growth, but they just haven't been able to keep up for the last couple of years.
Okay, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, if he would, to bring up the chart, Sheldon, on page 2. This is housing units per 1,000 population in G7 countries, and we're going to compare just a half a dozen or so of the major countries: France, Denmark, Japan, the UK, the US, and Canada. And for those listening on podcast and who can't see this, the bar graphs here, France seems to be doing much better than most in terms of building adequate housing per 1,000 population. Denmark in second, Japan in third, all of those countries above the G7 average. But then you get to the UK, the US, and Canada, and we are all building less than the average home building that is taking place in the G7. And Jenny, we heard some of the explanations for why it's that way in the province of Ontario. Maybe if you could broaden the microscope a bit and tell us why would it be this way across the G7 in so many places?
Notice that what we're particularly seeing is tight restrictions on supply in the Anglo countries, and that's because they share a similar approach to land use governance and development. In particular, we've chosen to devolve control over land use and development to local governments, and the process tends to empower existing residents. So people who already live in a community don't necessarily want more houses added. They're very sensitive about their property values, so they don't want rental housing added. And those existing homeowners come out to community meetings and complain about things and push back. That tends to block development or delay it, dragging out the process and making it more expensive. And if you think about who would benefit from building homes, it's usually people who don't already live in a community.
David, start us off on a discussion about nuclear energy. Do we need more of it to help us get through the climate crisis?
I would like to see more nuclear power because it has a low land footprint. And so if you're going to, I think one challenge of decarbonization is that there's no question we can decarbonize without nuclear power. The absolutely stunning improvements in the cost of solar mean that the pathway to large-scale decarbonization with solar looks much more real than it did 10 years ago. And my view is there's no necessity for nuclear. But there are lots of other technologies like hydro and wind, which have and biomass, which have comparatively big land and environmental footprints. And I do think, especially in a cold place with big winters like Canada, if you want to think about ways that solve the climate problem, that is stop putting CO2 in the air, and also reduce other environmental harms, I think it's important to take nuclear seriously. But that said, if you ask me how to do it, how practically, like which reactor technology and what government policy and what way to communicate with the public could get to something that, exactly as Holly said, is a socio-technical system that makes nuclear work, I have no idea. Every element of that is broken. Public trust is broken. The companies that develop these technologies have done in some ways a terrible job. I also have just horrific experiences from being on a top panel in Canada and talking to people at the Canadian Nuclear Agency and literally, no exaggeration, being lied to. So my faith as somebody who's a physicist and pro-nuclear in AECL just went to zero in that experience. So we've got broken trust, high costs, and problems. Yet I still think there actually is some real use for developing nuclear power in a climate future, and it's a big challenge to figure out how to do it.
AECL being Atomic Energy of Canada, the once upon a time Crown Corporation. Okay, Holly, you are literally a hop and a skip and a jump away from the Ontario border, and we depend on nuclear for about half of our energy mix, maybe some days more than half of our electricity mix here in the province of Ontario. I'm not sure what it is in New York State, where you are, but is it an option, do you think, to help get us out of the climate crisis?
Yes, I do. I don't think it's perfect. I think we're out of perfect options. And I'm very concerned about, as a sociologist, about social backlash to higher prices or lack of reliable energy. We've seen some fluctuations lately, with blackouts, with gas shortages in other parts of the world. Nuclear could be a solution to that. And if we don't fix that soon, I think all of our decarbonization goals could be threatened.
Marcus, what's your take on nuclear?
Somewhat similar. The scientist in me sees that it's a low footprint, low carbon electricity source. And if our goal is looking at climate or specifically looking at greenhouse gas load, it's something we have to take seriously. But I grew up in Ontario. I live in now California, where there's discussion of closing nuclear facilities. I'm always struck at how much dissonance there is between sort of the science view of things and what the general person that I'll ask, hey, what do you think about nuclear power is? A lot of people just think it's a disastrous idea. They think it's a symbol of the worst excesses of our industrial age. I don't quite see it that way. I think it can have a future, but I sort of agree that we don't have a lot of public space to actually have that conversation, and it's possible we may not be able to navigate through that. So it's hard to say, but I think it can have a future, but it'll be pretty tricky.
Gotcha.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.